Stormgate Audio presents a reading of Captain Hawklin and the Secrets of Monster Island. Created and written by Charles F. Milhouse. Read to you by Nick Brooks. Chapter 1, The Hooded Gunman. March 31st, 1930. Stephen stood at the shore of the Hampton Bay and watched the construction of the Silver Bridge as the early sun cast an orange glow along Crown City. He tilted the fedora to the back of his head and scratched his forehead. The construction crane towered over the skeleton of the bridge and looked like a dragon looming before an attack. Not as big as the proposed bridge they planned to build in San Francisco, the Silver Bridge was impressive, and though a specially built crane might not be big enough to help construct the bridge across the Golden Gate Strait, it managed to get the job done here. Stephen checked his wristwatch. It would be dark soon, and the day's work would come to an end, at the relief of the overworked men who toiled sun up to sun down on the final stage of the 24-month renovation of the city, completely financed by Stephen himself. Some saw him as a visionary, while others saw him as a lunatic, spending money on such frivolities at the beginning of a Great Depression. Stephen's biggest opponent was Milo Frederick, owner of the swanky Belmont Club and the big boss of just about everything from racketeering to the illegal hooch sold to the speakeasies from Crown City to San Francisco. He controlled the lower quarter of the city and was a sour reminder that Stephen would eventually have to deal with him. Despite Milo Frederick and a few others around town jeering his revitalization efforts, Stephen didn't mind the ridicule. In fact, he relished it. When he returned from his world travels 2 years prior, he intended on becoming revered. Though the name Hawklin wasn't as well known as Rockefeller's, he meant to make his presence known and outshine his father, who had made a name for himself in the shipbuilding industry. Stephen didn't want people to worship him because of his service in the Great War, though he'd been a pioneer in aviation combat. He wanted to be known for his service to the people of Crown City, his birthplace, that had fallen into disarray over the years, and to offer much-needed jobs. His plan? Revitalize the city, reconstruct it, and give it a new lease on life. At the cornerstone of that new lease would be the Silver Bridge, and at the top of that bridge's highest point would be his laboratory, his test facility, and his home overlooking the city that he loved. Stephen had his distractors. The most recent headline from the city's oldest and most trustworthy newspaper, the Crown Chronicle, read, "Hawklin's Folly. Businessman or rich playboy? You decide." It hit all the points with utmost certainty, crafting for its reading audience Stephen's life, though they did embellish on some certain points, which Stephen found amazing. What they did get right was his absence after the Great War and his trip around the world seeking adventure with his loyal and trusted companion, Hardy Reagan Miller. "I see you got a copy," Hardy said, approaching Stephen from behind. Stephen held up his paper and jiggled it in his hand, said, "Yes, I'm having it delivered every evening now." "Are you that concerned with what they've said about you?" Hardy asked. Stephen loosened his black tie and chortled. "I enjoy the funnies in the back," he mused. Hardy scoffed and asked, "They still trying to figure out how you came up with all the money to bankroll this project?" "Yeah, my favorite is, I broke into the Maraja's place and stole his most precious jewels." "Without knowing it, they weren't far from the fact," Hardy said under his breath. Stephen shot a side glance, his mouth turned down. Hardy was a tall man with wavy raven hair and dull copper eyes. His jaw was square and bristly. "You know that's not how it was." "I know how it was, Cap'n. I'm just thinking of all the men we left behind." Stephen's tweed dress coat felt constricted, and he adjusted it slightly and decided that casual work clothes might be better suited for his 14-hour days. He regarded Hardy for a moment. He was right. There wasn't a day that he didn't think about those people that he left behind, and Stephen swore the riches he brought back from his final adventure abroad wouldn't be squandered on women and booze. Before Stephen could say another word, a tremendous snap echoed across the bay. It sounded like the breaking of a piano string followed by a recoil. The sound ricocheted in the distance. Stephen's heart rose into his throat and gagged him. Shouts from the workers on the bridge followed, and Stephen dropped his newspaper to the damp shoreline. His brow tightened as the giant dragon crane began to sway and falter side to side. The darkened shadows of the two bodies fell against the backdrop of the setting sun and into the cold, murky water below. Steven ran to a small boat tied to a piece of driftwood on the stony beach. The wind caught the brine of his hat and blew it off his head. He shouted at Hardy, "Call some rescue teams in here, ambulances, fire department, police, anyone who can help." "Steven, wait!" Hardy's plea was drowned out by the roar of the boat's outboard motor as Steven steered it toward the base of the giant crane. The water was slick like black oil in the dim light and chalky. The small craft skipped over the turbulent waves caused by the swaying of the dragging crane. Steven steered the launch in a zigzag course, cutting across the waves which slowed his approach. Two bodies floated face down atop the murky soup, and Steven grimaced and gripped the rudder. Knowing there was nothing he could do for the two men, he left them be. His concern were the other half a dozen men still on the bridge. If he didn't stabilize the crane, it was a good bet the massive piece of machinery would slam into the unfinished bridge, killing more than just the workers. In the distance, Steven heard the horn of a tugboat pushing cargo through the bay. Surely it would be destroyed if the bridge fell. Tying his launch against one of the huge concrete pillars, Steven climbed hand over hand up the ladder embedded along the steel girder. Up, up, up he went. Nearly 50 feet he climbed. His heart dropped back to his chest and beat like a snare drum. Nervous, his damp hands slipped on the runners. He needed to get over to the crane before it was too late. The tie-down that harnessed the massive machinery to its base swayed in the evening breeze. Steven reached out, his eyes timing with the motion of the moving cord, and faded in the rapidly approaching night. He inhaled, and holding his breath, he pushed himself away from the ladder. The air escaped from his lungs when he took hold of the cable, swinging along with it. The perspiration of his hands mixed with the grease on the metal cord caused him to slip. Steven dug his Oxfords into the strand and lowered himself to a stop. Working himself out of his tweed coat, the oil on the cable stained his white shirt. With the help of his coat, Steven started an arduous climb back to where he started, trying desperately not to entangle himself in the garment. The twisting of the crane's metal structure cried out in indescribable groans and squeals. Among different gray and black shades of shadows, Steven saw the secondary cable winch neatly stored in its housing, with a metallic hook bolted to the end. With no time left to him, he swung to the other side of the massive machinery, his body wrenched at the awkward twist, reaching out and letting go of the cable as his arm met a run of the ladder feet away. Steven cupped his arm around it and pulled himself to safety, the pounding against the inner wall of his chest out of control. Filing his fears away, he uncoupled the secondary cable and released the hook, allowing it to fall. His objective? With a little bit of luck, secure the hook on or near where the other secure line broke. Unprepared, gunfire rang out from above. Bullets sparking on the steel structure and ricocheted in unpredictable directions. Steven dove for cover on a sheet of plywood used as a makeshift platform. A tin roof hid him from the attacker. More shots echoed in the ever-increasing nightfall, but they were fired haphazardly around him. Steven weighed his options. Before too long, he wouldn't be able to see his objective. If I can see it at all, he thought. A pause in the gun blast came, and Steven theorized the assailant was using a weapon with a 6-round clip. He didn't have much time. Darting for his cover, Steven grabbed the dangling cable and desperately tried to swing it back and forth, but the length of the line was too long, and the hook on the far end did not move. His face tightened. It's not going to work. Then Steven saw Hardy waving up at him, and a calmness draped over Steven. His face relaxed. Steven almost forgot about the gunman until more bullets rained down on him. He leapt for the protection of the tin roof, counting the shots. When he counted 6, he darted for the winch and tightened it in slack of the cable. The crane stabilized, and Steven locked off the cable and looked aloft. Gritting his teeth, Steven waited for another set of attacks, but no more shots came. Drawing up some hidden strength, he began his ascent to the control tower at the top of the crane. Steven found the control cabin empty when he arrived. It was completely dark now. The lights of Crown City dotted the night like jewels in a tapestry. It looked almost ethereal. A bite from the early spring wind bit at his face, and Steven wasn't sure if it was the altitude or his quickened pace to reach the top that stole his breath. Then he saw the darkened figure standing on the crane arm, a stone's throw from him. Besides a cape flapping in the breeze, all other details were lost to the night. Speechless, Steven waited, wondering if the attacker was going to use his revolver again, but nothing. "Who are you?" Steven shouted. No reply. If you wanted me dead, you had more than enough time, so that means you want something. I'm waiting." The dark figure raced forward but turned away before he reached Steven. His cape sounded like sheets blowing in the wind when the stranger leapt over an 8-foot gap between the crane and the incomplete tower apartment. Not to be denied answers, Steven filled his lungs with the thin evening air and followed. The moment between leaving the crane and impacting on the unfinished floor of the apartment was a matter of seconds, but felt like leaping the Grand Canyon. He reached out, fingers grabbing air. Steven tucked his body, landed on the bridge in a roll, and sprung to his feet with a surprising boost of adrenaline, turning on the balls of his feet to come face to face with the end of the stranger's revolver. Steven stood arm's length from the attacker, clear enough to see his face, but it was masked. "All right, you have me." "Don't get involved, Captain Hawklin. This is your only warning," the masked man's harmonic voice warned. Steven's brow furrowed. The last thing he liked was ultimatums, even if he didn't know what for. "I suppose you're not going to tell me what not to get involved in." My employer didn't feel the need to say, only to pass along this warning: "Don't get involved." Steven flinched when Hardy came into view. The split second his eyes diverted from the masked assailant gave away his companion's position. "Don't move or I'll shoot," Hardy warned. "Go ahead and shoot, Mr. Miller. Neither of us can miss at this range," the masked man said confidently. Steven eyed Hardy. His stalwart friend tightened his gun arm, and for a brief second it looked as if Hardy was going to fire. Unprepared, the hooded gunman swung his fist towards the floor. The shatter of glass followed, and a puff of smoke rose into the air. Steven stumbled forward, reaching out to snag the attacker, but the masked man vanished, and when the smoke cleared, only he and Hardy remained. "Don't you realize this is an election year? Or do you give a damn, Hawklin? I've no intention of losing this office because you're in the middle of some midlife crisis trying to impress a father who disowned you. My God, 2 of your workers are dead, and that eyesore of a bridge you're building could have fallen into the bay and killed a lot more." Steven and Hardy stood shamefaced for nearly 3/4 of an hour listening to the rants from the Crown City Mayor, Nicholas Anderson. Steven clutched his battered fedora in his hand. His jacket was covered in grease and smelled as if it had been on the floor of a workshop. He tried to figure out how he and Hardy got there. It was just a normal day until a little while ago. It didn't take long for the police to haul them into the precinct after the masked man disappeared and the dead construction workers were fished out of the drink. Steven held his tongue, deciding the best defense was to say nothing. After all, who would believe his story? That a masked man was delivering a message to not get involved in something? And Mayor Anderson wasn't a huge supporter of Steven's. Perhaps he was threatened by Steven's slowly rising popularity, or he was afraid Steven might influence the election. Anderson entered the police commissioner's office with 2 detectives and a uniformed officer who stood in the back of the office trying to look intimidating. The commissioner, a tall, hazel-haired, middle-aged man, stood behind the mayor, constantly taking his pocket watch from the inner vest of his gray-blue suit, checking the time. "Are you listening to me, Hawklin?" Anderson's voice sharpened. Steven tightened his jaw and offered no reply. Mayor Anderson was a small, impish man with a receding hairline and small, misshapen head that didn't match the rest of his portly body. His oversized nostrils flared when he spoke, and his red lips thinned, waiting for an answer. "Accidents happen, Mr. Mayor," Hardy interjected. The mayor bit off some expletives and spit them out before shouting, "Is that what you're calling it? An accident? Because the workers that weren't killed reported hearing gunfire, and the officers dispatched to the bridge found bullet holes. I want some answers, and I want 'em now." A knock came from the office door, and a tall, well-groomed dandy, wearing a blue and white suit with a dark necktie and carrying a black briefcase, strolled in. The police officers in the back of the room bullied forward, but the commissioner waved them back and said in a deep baritone voice, "Who are you, and who let you in here?" "Might I ask why my clients are being questioned without counsel present?" the dandy said firmly. His thin, trimmed, dark mustache twitched when he spoke. Reiterating the commissioner's question, Mayor Anderson asked, "Who are you?" "The name's Richard Hathaway. I'm Mr. Hawklin's attorney, and prepared to sue this city for misconduct if my client isn't released." Mayor Anderson hunched his shoulders to look formidable, and Steven held in the urge to laugh. "I haven't finished questioning either Mr. Hawklin or Mr. Miller yet," he said with an authoritarian reply. "Have my clients been charged?" Hathaway asked plainly. Mayor Anderson's eyes darted back and forth between Steven and Hathaway before saying in a less abrasive tone, "No." "Then we're finished here." Hathaway touched Steven on the shoulder, leading him and Hardy from the office. Browbeaten, Mayor Anderson fumbled over his words, but he was at a loss. Hathaway turned and in a firm tone said, "If and when you have a reason to charge my clients, we will be happy to sit down with you. Until then, have a good day, Mr. Mayor." "I wondered when you'd show up, Richie." Steven's words hung on the frosted night breeze when the trio exited the police precinct sometime after 11 o'clock. He pulled his fedora on his head. What good is it having a lawyer on retainer if he doesn't show up for 45 minutes after the fact? "I didn't know you were here until I heard the reports of the mishap at the bridge on the radio." "You could have called," Hathaway said, unfazed by Steven's callous remarks. "You mind telling me what happened?" "I don't think that would be a good idea," Steven replied. "How can you expect me to do my job when you won't tell me everything I need to know?" Hathaway asked, but didn't allow Steven to answer before he continued. "This is going to be a public relations nightmare, you know. I'm not sure you pay me enough. I might not ever get another client as long as I live." "I was a fool to have—" Steven clucked his tongue and rolled his eyes before interrupting his lawyer. "Calm down, Richie, calm down. If there's a need to tell you what's going on, I'll let you know." Hardy added under his breath, "If we ever figure out what's going on, that is." "Huh?" Hathaway asked with a twisted brow. Steven led the group across the street towards Hathaway's car. He pulled up the collar of his jacket as a chilly rain began to fall. An eerie feeling cautioned him, and he stopped in the deserted street. "Something up, Cap'n?" Hardy asked. Steven didn't know how to explain it. Perhaps it was because of the encounter earlier that evening that put him on edge. He wasn't the kind of person to frighten easily, but the unknown had a way of spooking him. The sound of gunfire drew Steven's attention up the street. Hardy grabbed Hathaway by the arm to pull him to safety. Steven stood on the balls of his feet, ready to dive for cover. Only then did he realize it wasn't gunfire. It was the backfire of an old jalopy racing toward them. One of its headlights burned out, and the other flickered as the car bounced up the street. Again the engine backfired and sounded like the kick of a 12-gauge shotgun. Hardy pulled Hathaway off the street, but Steven held his ground. For no apparent reason he was drawn to the vehicle. He tightened his muscles, waited for a moment, and then dove for cover and landed on the wet ground as the car raced by. Steven rolled on his side